which will tell you something about yourself, which I want you to record. Then we're going to do an experiment in memory, and we will be collecting data from each one of you about your memory processes. We're just going to see how we do as a group, and then use that as a means of explaining a great deal of information that's known about memory. After we summarize the data and look at it, then I'm going to give you something of a formal presentation on the basic things we know about memory, about forgetting, and about what you can do to increase the probability of your remembering things, and things you can do in applying them to a classroom situation that will increase the probability that your students remember. All of this will be organized around the basic ANISA theory of learning and theory of development. They're extraordinarily compatible, as it turns out, as you might imagine. So I need to ask Linda how we've done with our grouping, because I need to work for 60 seconds with each group of 6.
I think the best thing to do, since people walk in between, is to ask everyone in group one to raise your hands. Okay, everyone in 2. Everyone in 3. Okay, we already have 6. Everyone in 4. Everyone in 5. Okay, everyone in 6. All right, there's 7 and 6.
That's all right. We
Okay.
can take one group with 7.
Everyone in 7.
All right, that's all right. That's 2 groups of 7.
Would you join group 3? Okay. So you can just
Yeah. Now we need somebody who will do double duty in each group. We need a timer. So we need somebody with a second hand in each group. Who in group 1 has a second hand?
I have 2.
You will be the timer. Group 2, who's got a timer?
I have 1 also.
Who's got a second hand? Where's group 2? Who's my group 2 timer? Well, it's easier if you have your own watch. Otherwise,
Nobody has a watch with a second hand?
I can choose one.
have you got 2 watches? I tell you what.
You
No.
do have a second hand?
Extra short, yeah.
Okay, we've got a timer.
Okay, we got a timer. Group 3, who's my timer? You are. Group 4, who's my timer? Good. Group 5, who's my timer? Group 5, will you be the timer? All right. Group 6, all right, will you be the timer? In the maroon,
Okay.
brown. Group 7, who's the timer? All right, you with the turtleneck. Okay, so those people have a double burden on their memories. They have to remember what group they belong to and that they're also going to time. Now let me give you the directions that we, well maybe I better do my other little experiment first and then come back and give you the directions just before we do this exercise. Otherwise you will have forgotten the directions. That way I'll be applying my own thesis. What? Yeah, you remind me if I forget. Now, for this quick little first exercise, I want you to solve this problem, and I'll give you maybe 60 seconds to do it. Here's the problem. There is a cube, wooden cube, that is painted blue on all sides. In other words, the whole outside of the cube is blue. Yes? Now we are going to saw this cube in half this way, and in half this way, and in half this way, that you will now make lots of little cubes, all exactly the same size. In other words, we're going to trisect this cube. You got that? Doom, doom, doom. The question is, how many unpainted sides will that create? All right, go. No whispering and consultation. No consultation. Stop. Okay, how many cubes, how many sides are unpainted? Huh? 24. Now would you, may I see how many got that right? Okay. Now, would you, if those of you who got it wrong, and those, please make a note whether you will remember quite easily, I think, whether you got it right or wrong. Let me just see again how many got it right. No, I count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Some people seem to be not sure whether they got it right. There's only 124. Okay. The reason for doing this little exercise is that I'm interested to see how well you did on this task with the one coming up. Because some people have a better visual imaging system. They can create that cube in the mind's eye, and then they can do things with that cube. And once they've done those things, they can count or whatever they want to. But essentially, and mathematicians are good at this too, because they would figure out when you trisect the cube, you create 8 cubes that are identical. And then you can count the unpainted sides on one cube and multiply by 8. So you create 3 unpainted sides per cube. 3 times 8 is 24. All right, now for the next little memory exercise. This was an imaging exercise, not a memory exercise as such, except that if you are using a predominantly visual imaging system of memory, it will be easier for you to have recalled visually what a cube was like and therefore do things with it. But this was essentially trying to figure out whether or not you have a visual approach to things. Because the next memory task that we're going to do is a visual memory task. And there's some rules that we need to abide by. One is you have to be absolutely quiet. And you have to be quiet when the people come back in, because we're going to file out in groups of 6, and for 60 seconds examine some objects. And you'll come back in and sit down, and your timer will then say, go. And as soon as you're all seated. So you need to have ready, so you don't lose any time, paper and pencil. And then your timer is going to be responsible for saying go. And for 3 minutes, you will try to list the things you will have observed on this table out in the hall. And so be careful, don't stumble on the way back in, because the stumbling could completely cause to evaporate that experience out there. This is why students who go to exams having crammed, you know, they walk like this. They're afraid that if they sneeze or stumble, the whole thing will go. Now, while people are out there doing that experience, those who are back here waiting should fill out those issues forms. They'll leave you a little time to think about that. And then after a group has come back in and has done their 3 minutes, and their timer says time, and Linda is going to monitor the timing, the timers, to make sure that there's no fraud. Cheating, it's called. And it's going to be hard for the timers a little bit, because they've got to think and time. So if they get low scores, the Lord will forgive them. I don't know whether we will or not, but the Lord will. And as soon as you have turned your papers over then, there should be no talking, but you should go to your sheet and start filling out the issue form. Anybody who came in late, didn't get an issue form, can get one right now. Why don't you raise your hand if you didn't get an issue form? Anything else like that? Time quite right. You think you called too soon or too late? Too soon. Oh, well, this is how a scientific progress is impaired and permanently mutilated. Well, we'll keep track of you guys. All right, anybody else? Honesty is a virtue. Anybody else honest? No. All right. Now, what we're going to do is that I'm going to put the items on the board one at a time, and if you got that item right, I want you to raise your hand and, like Paul and Laura, to count how many got it right, and I'll record the number of the item. And then you'll count how many. Count the items that you have on your list now and put a number up at the top.
Do you give us more than one name of each item? Some of them
Oh, yes, yes. So just count your items and then put how many you got on the list.
What do you do with those that you've got in the wrong hands?
Well, we'll do those with those later.
Can I include that in my nine?
No. So now are the ones that you have on the one side. This is the ones that you were able to recall within the 3-minute period. No additions now either. All right? White box.
Raise your hands if you got it. Oh, smarties.
Smart, we have good names.
A good way to do it is do it by row. And
That's
then
all
you,
it is.
yes, okay. There's a blue pencil.
Blue pencil. All the way up, hands.
Take an average. There's a green candle.
Green handle. All the way up.
There's a small pink and white candle, birthday candle.
All the way up. Skip you up.
5. How many got only 5? Then you count, and I'm just going to call the numbers out, okay? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13? 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 8. 18.
5, 6, 6.
Don't just count on one side now.
Raise your hand up again.
5.
Is your hand up on? That's 6.
19.
I think it's
20.
4. Oh,
21.
Wait a minute, I think that was 3.
20.
20. How many have 20?
2.
21.
3.
22. 23. 24. 25. 26. Will 23 stand and take a bow, please?
The timer.
Oh, the timer? Oh, there's always conflict of interest in every... Now, let me just start... What?
Anybody get more than 26? Yeah.
Oh, yes, because I always have a hallucinator. One or two. Did anybody dream up an item? Come on, fess up, yes? Bottle cap.
Piece of chalk.
Piece of chalk.
I had a nail.
A nail.
Needle.
A needle.
Spray pen. Toaster.
Did anybody see a toad or a turtle? Because if you do, I need to see you right away because there's the impending psychic breakdown. I'm going to talk about what is called associative interference and the effect of anchoring ideas on stored items. But that's what happened to you guys. You anchored something you saw out there to an idea, and what that anchoring idea is so strong, it eventually causes to crumble what you actually experience, and it's just assimilated right into it. And that's why you can say, oh, I swear I saw such and such. This is why trials in court are so difficult, because you can almost get anybody to see anything in the same accident or the same crime or whatever, because of this phenomenon of associative interference that is very prevalent in human memory. Now, you'll see that our average begins to cluster right around 16, 17 items, which is just a little bit more than half of the ones that were there. Now, let me tell you a little secret about how you could have, all of you could have beefed up your memories. Is that when you don't know the full extent of your task, effort is reduced. If you had counted the items and you knew that there were 26, this will add 3 or 4 items to your list because something inside you says, I'm not anywhere near where I ought to be, and there is more cerebral effort gone into the issue. But if you don't know how many items there were in the first place, then you just kind of run out of steam, but there's nothing to spur you on. This is why when you're working with a child, if the child grasps the full extent of the task, it will create efforts to continue. And this must be particularly so for children experiencing learning disabilities. So you can help that child if, number one, the whole task is not beyond him. Let's assume that. And secondly, he knows what the full task is, because this will keep levels of trying up, and it will enable him to complete it. Now, I was watching your faces while you were looking at all this stuff, and honestly, the rapt attention was really akin to looking almost at a sacred object. The reverence sort of came out, really. And I would just love to have a peek inside your cerebral cortex to see how the cogs were moving and what's happening, because those who remembered more were consciously or unconsciously using some kind of memory assistance device. And I would like to hear from those who out there were consciously aware of how they were trying to go about remembering all these things, and if you would just say what it was. Yes?
I did it by grouping.
By grouping. What sorts of groups did you use?
Well, first off, I had a visual picture of the objects and tried to map it in my mind. This is one direction, other direction, other direction, other direction. These are clustered in this direction, and I worked in terms of metal objects and plastic.
All right, how many used a classification? First of all, let me ask on the first thing, how many used just a visual spatial kind of thing, like you try to know the credit card was down here and the candle was up here? Let me see how many used that. The problem with that method when you have lots of things is that the decay is very rapid. If you have 5 things or 7 things, then unless you've got what they call eidetic imagery type memory where you almost photograph the thing, but there are very few people who have that. So if you've got alternate ways of remembering things, the imaging one works for about 5 to 7 objects. When you get beyond that, the overload is too great for that system. The grouping, however, is another idea. And you mentioned metal objects, see, which would give you 6 or 7 of them because you've got staples, keys, screw, nut, bottle opener, tack, pin, penny, eyelet, bolt, paperclip, watch. You got about 8 or 9 items the minute you think of metal. And a quick way to remember that is to say to yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 metal. Now, remembering the 8 pushes the effort up for that category. That's not the only category, but that's one. If you use a shape category, you could say how many things are cylindrical. You got a candle, 2 candles, you got a pencil cap, you got a pencil, whatever else. You got a bolt, you got a screw. Another kind of category is called a functional category. Some of these things are office, have to do with office functions. You got paper clips and pencils and staples and letter openers and so on. For this task, color would not be a good coding thing because the colors were too diverse. You could have shape in terms of, rectangular shape. There was a patch of cloth, a credit card, a box, a book of matches, and a calling card, all of which had about the same size and shape, and you could have remembered 5 rectangular objects, and that would have helped categorize that. See, so if you remember 8 metal objects, 5 rectangular objects, pretty soon all of that is retainable, and it boosts effort in each category, and that would have boosted your final score. It's very interesting. In adults, credit card is almost always the highest. And this is because it's so meaningful in a materialistic civilization. It allows you to get things that you can't afford at the time that you get them. It's kind of an escape hatch. It enables you to transcend temporarily budgetary limitations, and people somehow feel that's a nice thing. Children, however, when I do this same test with children, 40 is way down. You also notice here that things that are the lowest is very strange because they're among the most familiar things. And it's curious, sometimes the most familiar thing doesn't retain in memory because you take it for granted when you see it. And you would think that keys and credit cards would be 2 things that would be pretty much the same but it turns out not to be that way, because if you lose your keys and you lose your credit card, of course you get 2 kinds of hassles if you lose either of them. But the door that a key opens is one. The door that a credit card opens is infinite, practically. They seem to have different meaningful and emotional connotations. Let me see what else is very low. Usually this is very low because people don't know what to call it, and so it doesn't connect with something in your mind. This is very frequently low, just as it was here, because it's so tiny. If I'd had a regular sized light bulb there, more of you would have gotten it, but many of you will not have had much experience with a light bulb of this size. Or if you do, it's only once a year, say at Christmas time, when you may be using it.
But it would have been easier to remember that if it had been separated, where your ground was, way up in the corner or something.
Yes, Well, I configured the things out there in such a way that it doesn't favor one category system over another. See, if I put all these rectangles together, all these metal objects together, you would have done much better. But I wanted to see whether or not you automatically approach a memory task with an organizing device, because this is number one principle in improving memory, is categorizing them at the time of storage. And this means when you present something to your children, if things are classified at the time of storage, you will increase the probability of their retrieving it. I'll go into that a little bit later. So there are a number of category systems: function, shape, color, size. So some objects were tiny and some were big. Composition, let's just say some were paper, some were metal, so on. So you could have actually category systems in which one object might fit more than once. For instance, you could say all paper objects. Then you say all rectangular objects. Well, that will cross-file for you, and if you don't get it in one category, you'll get it in the other. On the other hand, if you develop more than 7 category systems, you won't be able to retain it very well. So, see, if you have 26 category systems, which is probably what some of you tried to use, is just as heavy a burden. I mean, that's like one item per category then. It doesn't help you any. There was a hand up. Yes?
How did you decide which items you were going to use?
Well, I just simply said to myself, I wanted people to have at least 8 or 9 category systems. And I just set them down and went around the house and got objects that fit into those categories. So you'd have a functional category, a size category, a composition category, a shape category, and so on. Yes?
What if you take a category like I did right in my desk? I've got a junk drawer. That's what that reminded me of.
Yes.
Now that helped me to a great deal with the ones I've got.
Yes.
But then it limited, it excluded completely the others, so I know some very well, but others aren't possible.
The problem with just a junk category itself is that junk by definition is ready organized. Because the minute you organize it, you don't call it junk, you call it equipment. Or whatever, you know. But to the extent that things were out there that's in your junk drawer that you know very well, then it would help. Now there is another memory device which is idiosyncratic. As to say, it would only help you and nobody else. And that's a little bit like what that was. You have a personal junk drawer that has some of these things in it. Of course, every household has a junk drawer, and it's bound to have some of these things in it, too. Now, would you just pass your lists down to the corner and have Linda pick them up? You don't have to, don't put your name on it. What? Well, I'll give them back to you. You could recognize your own handwriting. How many people will that involve? How many people? All right, I will just stick it away, because I don't want you glancing at it now. That's what I want, because I want to move on to something else. I don't want any proactive interference now with what I'm going to say. So just put that out of the way. Yes? Yes, I'm going to erase it shortly. Would you all like to stand up and just wiggle a bit and get the blood flowing? Yeah.
You want to have the break now? You're through in 45 minutes.
Yeah, let's have the break now. That's a good idea. Got below 18 on this test that we just did. Yeah, you got below 18 on this test, and how many of you who got 24 of the cubes? You got a right answer on the cube thing. Let me see in the hands of those who got the right answer on the cube thing. Now, how many of you, let me just count that first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's what I got. Now, how many of you got below 18 right on this test? But who got 24 right on the cube test? we're only dealing with the cubists, the Cubans. Let me see it again, please. 4, 5, 6. And that meant 4 got above. Usually, if you transferred that imaging capacity to the storage of memory for this test, almost always those people get below the average in the memory of a long list, because they will use that same system of memory for storing items for which that is not an appropriate means. Now, some people have multiple approaches to storing memory, and that may have been this 4 down here. They did the cube thing right because they have imaging powers, but when it came to another task for which those powers were not particularly important, then they probably switched to a category system or whatever it is. Well, now let me just give you a quick run-through on some basic perspectives on memory and forgetting and what you can do to improve memory. First of all, a definition. Memory refers to the functional capacity to register, to store, and to retrieve information derived from any experience the organism has. And in ANISA, experience is defined by interaction with environment. And that environment includes the organism's own self, so that you can cook up something in your own head like a dream and still remember it. In other words, you have the capacity to create something intrapsychically and remember it. Memory is therefore a record of the past, spilling from the present. And when it is organized with an eye to the future, you have the phenomenon of transcendence, as we call it in the ANISA model. It's what Whitehead referred to as the conceptual anticipation of the future. And people who have their memory system organized so that it focuses to facilitate decision-making in the present with an eye to what they want to accomplish in the future are those whose energy systems are organized with maximum efficiency for getting where they want to go. Now, I want to just say a quick word about the difference between memory and learning. There's obviously an extraordinary overlap. But even in common parlance, and I found this true with people who speak widely differing languages, we tend to think that memory is the evidence of learning, and nobody would deny that. And yet there seems to be a difference, because you would never say, "Did you learn what you had for breakfast?" We would be more likely to say, "Did you remember what you had for breakfast?" And in fact, how many here can remember what they had for breakfast? It took me a while, but I got it. Yes? How many can't remember what they had for breakfast? So you see? Now, let me ask you this question. Why are you bothering to remember such trivial things? Which won't be, huh? Because you had to cook it? Well, that's not a... Well, that may explain why you remembered it, but it's not a very good reason for bothering to remember it. But the point is that certain items of common experience, if they're in the relatively recent past, are simply automatically recorded by the mind, and you don't even have to do anything about it. But that is really not learning. Learning requires more effort and is different from remembering, just in a very general sense, in that learning requires an association of the new information and a reorganization of what you already have stored. Now, if you just take that one thesis, you can see some extraordinary implications for teaching children, because the way you go about teaching can help them integrate the new stuff with the old. This presumes, however, that you have an idea of what they have stored. This is why knowing children in their specificity is so important for a teacher, because if you don't know, you won't help make the connections. In the ANISA system, we use the word immanence, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E, to refer to the totality of one's experience stored in the memory. Storing new experience and being able to retrieve it depends upon how well the present experience connects with the immanence. Number two, if the immanence, that is to say, what is stored there, immanence is a theological term, actually. It means indwellingness, and is referred to the indwellingness of God, actually. But in the Whiteheadian system, which is too complicated to explain now, Whitehead more or less makes the assumption of the capability of almost all things to be symbolically experienced and stored. And since he defines God as the sum total of the unactualized potential in the universe, plus representations of all of those things that are actualized, then to that extent, the image of God is within you. I know it will not please your minister to hear all of this, this definition of God. It somehow lacks warmth. But from an intellectual point of view, it's a very stimulating idea. And we've used the idea of immanence to reflect the capacity of the organism to store symbolically those things that it has experienced. And in a sense, the immanence represents a record of actualized potential. Now, if that immanence is well organized and tidy, it is easier to add more things to it. If it is disorganized, it means that the immanence itself, when brought to bear on a present experience, does not help organize it so that it gets stored in a way that it is likely to be retrieved. Or if it is, there will be a highly idiosyncratic method of going about remembering the experience. And there is only so much of that that the organism can bear. That's why the more ordered your presentations are to children, the more ordered the sum totality of their immanence will be as it is derived from school experience, which will mean that the more things that get added will be more easily retrievable. Now, I think school systems are largely organized in a way that from the child's point of view, since the subjects come rather fragmented, it mitigates against an ordered immanence and therefore constantly reduces the likelihood of things being remembered. And this must be a tremendous burden on any child who has reduced physiological or anatomical apparatuses to accomplish that. So that for a child who's having, say, who has brain damage or something, the thing is do fewer things more slowly, with repetition, highly ordered, and connected with what experiences you already know the child has. And that will enable you to move as quickly as possible for that kind of a child. Actually, it's true for adults too. you're better off if you do fewer things, do them well, have a little repetition, and have them connected with your past, because anything that comes in now that is connectable to the past is experienced as meaningful, unless the repetition is overbearingly boring, in which case the element of novelty is missing, and when the element of novelty is missing, the likelihood of storing is reduced, because the level of attention or arousal is reduced when novelty is totally missing. That's why repetition with slight variation is the best approach. So you should keep that in mind when you're working with a child who's having a real trouble remembering something. Give it to him time and time again, but introduce a little bit of variation so that you have arousal and novelty. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about reception, or what some people call sensory register, and storage and retrieval. Another set of terms that I can use to talk about this is a set of two terms: short-term memory, STM, and long-term memory, LTM. Sensory register simply means that it gets in. Short-term memory is a part of the brain which makes a decision as to whether or not what got registered will in fact be put into long-term storage. If it is not, there will be no hope of its retrieval. It is amazing, however, how much the short-term memory mechanism, or part of the brain, allows to get through. Like, for instance, what you had for breakfast. One reason what you had for breakfast is so easy to remember is that there is a kind of total experience involved in eating and things like that, and you can move back and picture yourself in that circumstance. And that's what I did this morning. I tried to think. I at first thought I'd eaten in the campus center. But then I realized Linda called me and talked me out of eating there and said, let's eat in Suffield at the Ramada, or at the Airport Inn. And so I tried to remember my breakfast, but since I had not been to the restaurant in the campus center this morning, I couldn't remember what my breakfast was, because I had no breakfast there. And suddenly I thought, my memory is failing me. And then I realized I wasn't even there. I was in the Ramada Inn, the airport, the old Airport Inn, and I saw myself go right in there and sit down with Linda across the way, reading to me and digesting for me an article about teaching gorillas how to talk, while I ate a poached egg and a Danish roll with a cup of coffee. And I had butter on it, and I put 2 little bits of cream in my coffee with 1 sugar, and I had 1/2 cup refill. So I have almost total recall of the whole thing. And she kept saying, I won't interrupt you anymore. And then she'd say, oh, listen to this. Because all these gorillas, are learning this sign language, and it really is killingly funny, the sorts of things they say, because they're quite a tease in what they say. Well, you've got taste buds, you've got motor movements, you've got visual impressions, you have auditory impressions, all surrounding breakfast. And that's very easy, because you get storage in all those areas. Whereas if you were looking at a sequence of numbers on a page this morning, it wouldn't involve very much. And so 24 hours later, you won't remember the sequence of numbers, because there's less involvement. So here's another principle. The more sensory modalities that are involved in a given experience, the more likely it will be retrievable, because it seems to be stored in more than one spot. Of course, the truth of the matter is, it doesn't look as if memory as such is localized in one spot, because you can remove 35 to 40% of the brain and still have memory. There's certain exceptions to that. If you ablate the speech area, there's a special part for speech, then speech goes, and you'll have trouble remembering, and so on. But sensory register, let me get back to that, simply means that it got in. You see, when I'm looking out into this room, I cannot take in everything, even though it looks as if every single space is taken up and that my retina is full of you and the walls and the light and the ceiling and so on. Nonetheless, I cannot take it all in at every second. I will select certain things, which means that other things will not even be registered. If they are not registered, there's no hope of them getting into short-term memory, in which case short-term memory won't even have to make a decision whether or not it gets into long-term memory. But let's assume something registers. There is the mesial bilateral side of the temporal lobe. There's a little place. Here it is. If you look at the brain from the front like this, and it's split down here, and the temporal lobes come around like that, there's a place right there on both sides. That seems to be the place that mediates the function of short-term memory. And the reason we know that is, it has come from some experiments, some experience of people at the Montreal Neurological Institute associated with McGill University, where people found that they could successfully control epilepsy by freezing or ablating or creating lesions in the spot where the epileptic seizure begins. You know, epilepsy is a functional disorder associated with a violent burst of nerve firings that starts in one place and spreads throughout the brain. And if it gets to the motor cortex, then you go into convulsions and usually collapse and so on, and then the seizure is over. And they found that if they could ablate or cut out or freeze that area, and you can find out where the area is by EEG analysis, usually. If you ablate that area, then you get no more epilepsy. Now, certain areas are more dangerous to ablate than others. For instance, if it starts in the speech area and you ablate that area, then you have total speech impairment. But there are a lot of places in the brain where a seizure can begin, and you can cut that part out, and nothing seems to happen. There don't seem to be any impairment of memory or functioning or anything else. However, when patients came in with this area being the place where the seizure began, and they ablated the area, they completely deprived that person from ever remembering anything else in life. Their total present experience was in short-term memory alone. Short-term memory lasts only a few seconds, and in some cases, just a millisecond or two, just a few milliseconds. You can prolong short-term memory by a perpetual rehearsal of the thing you're experiencing, but the minute you focus your attention on something else, it goes. They had a piano player whose area of the brain here had been ablated. Now, this man could remember his total past, as to say he could remember his entire musical repertoire, but he could not learn any new pieces. And furthermore, when he gave a concert, and they would tell him what piece to start with, he would start with that piece because he knew it. But the minute he finished and bowed and went off stage, when he came back out, he thought it was the beginning of the concert, and he wanted to play the same piece over. And they would just they had to tell him, well, the audience has decided doesn't want to hear the first piece, so you have to start with the second piece, because he'd already played the first piece, but he couldn't remember it. And they try to get him to go through the whole concert that way, until finally they just say, start with the last piece. And which made him very uncomfortable. He had to give it up. It was too much strain on him, because he thought, well, how can you play only the last piece and get your money's worth? And of course, it's very tricky, because the time passes and it's always a surprise that it's as late as it is, because previous moments have not been rehearsed. There was another person that had the same, had lesions in the same area, and Brenda Milner, who's one of the researchers there, was doing research on him, and she'd given him a group of numbers, 4, 5, 6, to remember, and she left him in the room and went out and came back fully expecting that he would have forgotten it, because she left several seconds or a minute or two go by. When she came back and said, "What are the numbers?" he said 4, 5, 6, and she was astounded. And she found out that he had said 4, 5, 6 out loud, so that it had come out and gone in his ear, which enabled short-term memory to hear it again, and before it faded, he said 4, 5, 6 out loud again, which went into his ear, got the nerve endings going, and before it faded, he said 4, 5, 6 again. So by just saying 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, he could remember 4, 5, 6 indefinitely. And he was still doing it after he had said it to her. He said 4, 5, 6. He went on inside his head, probably subvocally, saying 4, 5, 6. And then she reports that a truck had gone by and backfired, and they both went to the window to look out. And then she turned to him and said, "What's the number?" He said, "What number?" Because the distraction now made it impossible for him to rehearse the sequence. So there is some anatomical evidence now in the brain for a short memory term function, and there's a lot of research going on about this, and I suspect things will change as well. We also know that in short-term memory, time is the thing that's the enemy of storage in short-term memory. The minute a certain amount of time goes by, it's gone. Whereas long-term memory, the enemy of it usually turns out to be associative interference factors. And when Chuck said that he thought of his junk drawer, if you're not careful with that, pretty soon you've got associative interference going on, because now he will begin to imagine things in his junk drawer out on the table, and now he won't know which is which. And this is called associative interference, or another kind of interference. It's called inhibition or interference, and you can have two types, either proactive or retroactive inhibition or interference. Proactive inhibition or interference is when what you are learning now is being interfered with by what you already know. That's when information coming in doesn't match very well with what you've got, and so it's scrambling what you've got. Retroactive inhibition means that what you are learning now is scrambling and interfering with what you've already got stored. And it's kind of a two-way street there. That's why if teachers really know what's stored in their children's heads, they can proceed in a way that minimizes the possibility of these kinds of inhibitions. I did an experiment once without knowing all of this. It was just a hunch I had. It's when I was in the Army, and there were a lot of children of GIs and who wanted their children to have piano lessons. And I was just beginning to think about some of the basic ANISA ideas, and I was getting ready to shift my whole career away from a concert artist to behavioral scientist. And I was very interested in what happens to children who take piano lessons. Because as soon as they leave the place where they have the lesson and go home, they start rehearsing errors. Now, those errors get stored in memory. And it is very difficult, well, it's impossible, to deliberately forget something. The most you can do is remember the right way and store it, and it usually gets stored right along with the wrong way, and now you have to add to it, this is wrong and this is right. Now, you'll have a lot of words like that. I have one like across. I can never remember whether it's got 2 C's or 1. And you probably have some children who've learned with the look-say method will have millions of these problems because they're looking not at distinctive attributes of the letter that make up the word, but they're looking at such things as word shape, which does not differentiate enough the letters, and therefore they don't have a good sense of spelling. Look-say method of reading always produces, on the average, a whole lot of very poor spellers for that reason. Now, I want to just talk very briefly about some elements that facilitate memory, in addition to those that I've already mentioned. Incidentally, there will be types of memory associated with the basic categories of potentialities as itemized by the ANISA model. There will be biological memory, and this functions in terms of the genetic code. It functions, the whole immune system of the body functions in this way. You know, when you get a vaccination for smallpox and they put this stuff in you, there are biological creatures that grab that little bit of disease that you put in, and they take a complete reading on its profile. They make, in effect, a kind of key and lock imprint, and then they jam the lock. And this is why when the real disease comes, it doesn't have a chance, because the body has already stored in biological memory a profile of that disease. Now, it's interesting, memory fails a little bit after time, and that's why you need re-inoculation. But there is a function, an extraordinary function of what I'm calling biological memory that goes along with that category of potentiality. Then there will be 5 types of other memory. There will be psychomotor memory, which you can recall what it feels like to do a dive. This is precisely why a diver can perform a swan dive each time, and it won't look like some other kind of dive, because there is recorded in the motor cortex a sequenced pattern of which muscles and which cells have to contract at what time, in what sequence, at what speed, in order to produce that dive. You would not get a Nadia Comaneci if you did not have a psychomotor memory. There's a perceptual memory. I can ask you, do you remember what onions taste like? Do you remember what an onion looks like? Do you remember what an onion feels like? And you will be able to recall memory from those modalities which will define for you a pretty good stored symbolic notion of what an onion is. So there will be psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and volitional types of memories. We have yet to work out a detailed system for facilitating memory in all of these areas. That's something we're working on now. What we tend to remember, though, are very large patterned uses of energy that reflect an expression of all of those modalities. And these patterned uses of energy we call values. And it is knowing how you use your energy in these patterned forms that creates your identity. And you remember who you are to the extent that you remember those total patterned uses of energy. And that's how somebody else knows you pretty much too. They might know what you look like, but to really know a person is to know how they use their energies. So that old question, know thyself, which you could add to it, remember thyself, means knowing how you use your energies. And this is stored in some total way and lets you realize who you are. And you can predict for yourself then how you might behave in unusual circumstances or in similar circumstances, because you know what you do. And without knowing that, you would never be able to alter a habit, because you wouldn't even remember what it was you were trying to alter. Nonetheless, The sort of immanence I'm talking about now, the total organized memory of how you use your energies, is very difficult to alter. Because when you alter it, your identity changes, your personality changes. And some very intense experiences, like deaths or severe disappointments or traumas, tend to scramble things, and you get new patterns after that. Now keep in mind also something else, namely our definition of learning, which is the ability to differentiate, integrate, and generalize experience, is highly associated with the basic means of facilitating storage. I just mentioned to you a moment ago that I cannot see all of you at once, so I must extract certain things. That extraction is a form of differentiation. What happens, though, when I have an experience in school and I extract what is irrelevant? It means that is all that gets stored. A way you can make something have distinction is to associate with it an emotional reaction or increase involvement. And incidentally, moving the large muscles associated with anything you want the child to learn abstractly facilitates memory for that thing. So if you got up to the child and couldn't remember 3 times 4 is 12 and said 3 times 4 is 12 and made him do it 3 times, he would not forget what 3 times 4 is 12. He would remember that forever. However, if you went through the entire multiplication tables with physical movements, now the psychomotor burden, the burden on psychomotor memory is so great that it begins to interfere. But you see, 3 times 4 is 12, and even you yourself now, because it's known that when you see somebody moving their muscles, you yourself have impulses going to the same muscles I was moving, will have facilitated your remembering this experience on this occasion more than some others. This is why dance is a very powerful art medium, because when you see those bodies moving, you tend to get a sympathetic response. And it's not enough to cause you to move your own muscles necessarily, but you're still getting the impulses. Now, if you watch a boxing match, if you've seen people watching a boxing match, they're going like this, sitting there. Or if it's a particularly crucial football play and you watch the people who are watching television, they're out there passing the ball and so on. Or if you're driving with a reckless driver, you'll find that you're putting the brake on on the right-hand side of the car because you're having a sympathetic reaction to all of these things. So feature extraction, which is differentiation, is very important. This is why learning competence, which is the conscious ability to make the extraction, and which we define as a part of learning competence, obviously has this very direct association with memory. Now, integration means associating or matching what's happening or what's coming in with other things that are coming in, and matching that and integrating it with something that's already there. Integration creates meaning. Integration creates pattern. And things that are patterned are more easily remembered. No pattern means random. Randomness means no meaning. No meaning means no storage. However, you can remember that the experience you had was meaningless even though you can't remember the experience itself. In other words, you can read a book that is beyond you, and you can remember that this book was terrible in the sense that you couldn't understand it. But you cannot remember what it was you couldn't understood. What you couldn't understand. It slipped over. Store something, put an address on it, and then you'll be able to find it. And the best way to do that is that the address should be something that you can easily get access to in your own head because you often go there. And the instance of that here would be when you categorized a system and say, I'm going to put all metal objects here. Metal object now puts an address on that item. Let me just list them all. Rehearsal and repetition helps subjective organization. Chunking is another word for ordering something. And it's very hard to remember more than 7 items that are unrelated. So you should, if you're giving new material to a kid, don't go over 7. If he's slow for some other reason, don't go over 2 or 3. You consolidate memory if you review what you've just done sooner as opposed to later. In other words, if you do something once and you wait 12 hours, the returns on that won't be so good as if you just wait 1 hour and do it again. Of course, you should do it 12 hours later too, but the 12, for the time invested, you're going to be better if you do it closer, sooner, as opposed to later. Attentional functions are important determinants of memory. Every time you have a distraction, memory is impaired. Novelty is important because it increases arousal, and people tend to pay attention to something that's new. However, if it's brand totally new, then there's nothing to connect with, and so you lose meaning. That's why you only want a little bit of novelty. Being fatigued impairs memory, so you need to be fresh. I've already said if you move muscles, which is one form of involvement, you're going to get better storage. And finally, if you can use advanced organizers when you're presenting material, cognitive material, by creating in children anchoring ideas, which are anchoring points you know they already have in their heads, then you aren't leaving it up to them to find the anchoring idea. You actually fish it out for them. And this would be particularly important for children who are having disabilities and difficulties. You need to make sure the anchoring point is there. And before you start doing something, find the anchoring point, and you'll find this kid will then hook it onto that and be able to retrieve it more actively. Yes? Sure. Supposing you know that the child likes something. For instance, he has a passion for chocolate ice cream. And you're going to talk about something now. And you can anchor it. I mean, this is just an absurd idea, but it'll still work. You anchor what it is he's learning to chocolate ice cream, and he'll retrieve it more readily. An anchoring idea is in a form of an address. So he files it. Now, of course, if you anchor too much to chocolate ice cream, then it'll be too complicated, you see. And but once you get to know a child well, you know what he retrieves most easily, and that will tell you what anchoring points are there. And most people have vast possibilities of anchoring things. There are these little devices are called mnemonic devices. M-E-O-N-M-I-C, mnemonic, and they all refer to ways of connecting with something in your mind or creating an ordering scheme. For instance, if I give you that nonsense sequence of letters, and I said, in 2 weeks, I want you to remember this, and erased it now, it would be a very probability if I came back in 2 weeks that you would know what it is. However, if I told you that it's frown spelled backwards, in 2 weeks you would all remember, especially if I said, everybody frown now. Because that's moving the muscles, directly associated with the word. It gets stored in 2 weeks. If I came and asked you, would you remember what word I put on the board? You would all say frown. And it would be quite effortless. However, if I left it like that, chances are there wouldn't be anybody who remembered it in 2 weeks. Now, my point is, for lots of children, 60% of the day is like this. So you now know why so little is retained. Because it doesn't get anchored to anything. Because we haven't built the anchoring point and drawn it out and connected stuff to it. We've missed that out. Now, have you got 60 seconds? Because I want you to take a fresh piece of paper and write down the list of things you had out there. And I want to compare what you did first with what you did second. You have 3 minutes. Yes, right now. But that's why I want to pick up your other paper, see?
You need paper?
Because I don't want you cheating by peeking at your other paper.
Write it,
You're
write it.
writing right now. How many got 25? 4. 24. 23. 22. 21. 20. 19. 18. 17. So on. Well, there are two things operating here. There's a fight between decay because time has lapsed, a lot of information has come in. But, so that will cause decrease in memory. But we rehearsed this list right after you had done it. Because I put all the names on the board, you had to look at your list a whole lot of times. And therefore that will boost the possibility of memory. Incidentally, that's something you might want to keep in mind in the way you teach reading. If you teach a short reading lesson and repeat it 3 times in a day, you will have more recall on the average than one big lesson, which doesn't get repeated until the next day or 2 days later. Actually, the way in the ENISA system ultimately reading would be taught is that you would have some formal part of the day where, a reading is formally addressed, but that there will be a subsequent review of that lesson shortly afterwards, not taking the same amount of time, but much, much less. And then everybody else in the system who knows what that reading lesson is now emphasizes those same points. In fact, learning the symbol systems of math, the arts, and reading, the language, are so important in these because they are main vehicles of the organization and enrichment of immanence. And that means, you have more equipment to bear on the present, which means you have a better future. Well, that's it for today. Laura has an announcement, and then you can go.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Help with that spelling page. Wait till all 3 groups have met, and then I'll help you with it. Okay? Dave? John Jim? The next story. 2 weeks old and on his own. No, we want to do this. We had a little problem yesterday, and I want to solve it. Chris, I want to meet you with us. Debbie, I want to see you at my
But here, I'm gonna sign it. Let's put cards there. No, I'm gonna. This is cute. I can see you writing. I'm have to go. Yeah, I can go with it. I have to. Can you go put this in just in your thing? So what? Is that supposed to be in? It is. This is mine. Watch it. Oh, come on. Oh, yeah.
what's this going to read? You're going to need a reading book and your workbook, okay? Clover. Okay. Jennifer? Did I see you get my paper?
Zach, I'm going to pencil. Where is it? Zach, we're going to need a pencil.
Would you borrow? I don't like that.
Is that for you?
No, I don't. Not her. Take a look at these words up here. One and two. Robert, you can read these three.
Man, Arthur's, read, recall.
Good. Read them all three again.
Man, Garcious, recall.
Okay. There's a C in all of these three words. How did the C sound?
The first one
Yeah, just these three words.
was the K.
Like the K. How did K sound? Mark, read these three.
Silver, pencil, sidewalk.
Those words also had a C. How did the C sound in them? Take a look at what letter came after a C in all of these words.
Oh. Consonant. Vowel.
Not just any vowel. Two vowels in particular.
E-I.
E or I. You see that, Robert? Yeah. C-E, C-I, C-I, C-E. Do you think you could make up some rule about what happens when E or I comes after a C?
What's the question?
Tell them the question.
Make up a rule that,
What happens when E and I come after a C?
you make an S sound.
What makes an S sound?
The C and the E. C or I.
Just the C. When you were trying to pronounce that word, you tried Esau. Well, you made that sound like an E. Okay, you can remember that that will never happen if it doesn't have an E or an I. That's something that should be helpful to us. Okay. I'm going to read some words, some sentences, and you fill in those words. Okay. Something, the salt, and sugar together in a bowl. Sifted. Okay. Mrs. Brooks used something to make sure the board was really flat.
Level.
A level, that's it.
And that's like it goes two